John from Supabase here. If you haven't heard, next week is launch week number 5, and we have so many cool things to share with you. But before we get into all of that, our founders Ant Wilson and Paul Copplestone caught up to talk about why Supabase is open source, how we're helping to support existing open source communities as well as creating new ones, and how our $80 million Series B funding is going to help us do even more. Let's get into it.
I'm Ant. I'm one of the founders of Supabase.
I'm Koppel. I'm one of the other founders of Supabase. So, we're publishing this because we just released the blog post on how we have been spending our money so far. And we also are highlighting some of the ways that we plan to spend the money. We're in this quite unique position that we're an open source company 2 years in, and we've received over $100 million to spend basically just to build open source software. And so that's pretty cool. We think that's cool. And we think that our community has been a huge part of that, and they deserve to know how we plan to spend a bit more and hopefully get involved and maybe even find out ways that we can pay you to help build a nice open source community.
And maybe we can just give a quick high level, like, what is Supabase?
Yep. So Supabase is an open source Firebase alternative, and we're building the features of Firebase, but using open source tools. We try to use existing open source tools wherever we can. So we try to find good communities, good tools, good scalable tools, and then support them rather than building from scratch. It's actually, despite our early positioning as the open source Firebase alternative, it's really better to think of us as a PostgREST as a service company. Our goal is to make PostgREST incredibly easy to use by providing services on top of it that make you, the developer, incredibly efficient, and so that you can build products which will scale to billions of customers.
In fact, the first pitch, the first idea we had for Supabase was like a PostgREST marketplace, right?
Yeah.
It'd be like all these templates, plugins, add-ons, and then it slowly evolved into this Firebase alternative over the course of the first few weeks.
The app store for PostgREST, that's plugins
and that's the way it's kind of going, right? Is we're building a lot of open source extensions now for PostgREST and making them available as add-ons on the platform. So maybe we will eventually just become the marketplace for PostgREST extensions. And so one interesting question is, we always talk about ourselves as the open source Firebase alternative. Why open source? Like, why for you? Like, what got you into open source? Like, we're both quite philosophically aligned with this idea of everything we do must be open source, but why?
Like, I couldn't remember a wow moment of like, oh, this one thing. It's just like that is the way. Like, it just seemed. Can you remember your first?
I did an internship. The office I joined were just so heavily into open source, and all of the other regional offices were using like Oracle, and these guys were just like, no, we're not going to spend anything on this tech. We're going to use PostgREST. We're going to use WordPress. We're going to use Magento for e-commerce. And they were just so into like building and maintaining the tools themselves. And I also remember an early coworker telling the story of like early Microsoft, where they would, release their OS, and it was basically illegal to go in and fix your own bugs, to like fix bugs in the OS. You'd have to write to Microsoft, and then they'd say, yeah, we're aware of the bug and we're not planning to fix it anytime soon. And I just remember thinking, wow, like, I never want to be in that position.
Yeah. Imagine that version of the world. Like, it's just feels so far removed.
And it feels like a good way to like take on the big guys as well. Like these big proprietary software houses, it's like, one way to even compete. Because, at the start of a startup, you really don't have much resource. So you're reliant on like the kind will of strangers to to help you in this fight.
And my favorite story from this is from our journey was the company that really needed Azure logins before they could use Supabase, and they kind of let us know on a Monday. By Wednesday, they had the PR, and PR merged, and by the Friday, it was released onto the platform. So literally, they went from I need this and I'm blocked to 5 days later on the platform, ready to use, something that they had contributed themselves. Just imagine like we could get that with I don't know, AWS or any of the tooling that we use. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think as a company, you focus on like 80% of the user base. If 80% of the users are asking for a feature, then you better go and build it. But like you mentioned, what about this 5% who really want the Azure plugin, or they really want some other adapter? It's in a lot of proprietary companies, it would just get ignored, right?
Yeah.
So giving them the ability to just build it themselves solves for these. And it's not even like necessarily a small segment of the user base. It's just like not the 80%.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what are the common ones then? Like good reasons to open source hiring. I mean, we've done incredibly well with our hires just because, open source contributors are everywhere, and then probably a huge portion of our team were just people who were contributing and were too good to ignore, essentially. And especially in the early days, right, we didn't have a lot of cash. We had a lot of tools for the amount of people that we had in the team. So people were coming in and solving bugs and solving a lot of them, or pushing features. And then they could have been in Peru or Ukraine, the people in different parts of Europe, and anywhere that they were, it didn't really matter. We, as a distributed company, could find these very talented people, and I think in that regard, open source is just a secret weapon, and you can get some incredible developers.
And it solves one of the biggest problems in hiring as well, which is like, okay, you've seen the person's profile, you've tested maybe the technical ability, but what the biggest question when hiring someone is, how are they going to interact with the team, and how do they communicate? How are they going to communicate with the team? And by contributing to the open source repo first, you get to learn that before they've even come on board, which just removes this large headache that everyone experiences when hiring, right? So you mentioned Peru. Maybe it's a good time to talk about Steve and PostgREST. So maybe you can just give a quick high-level overview of what PostgREST is.
Yeah, so PostgREST auto-generates a RESTful API on top of your PostgREST schema. So you can concentrate on building out your PostgREST database, your schema, your data model, and then on top of it, PostgREST will generate the RESTful API. You can do nested joins, you can call PostgREST functions, you can do all sorts of neat stuff, and it kind of acts as an HTTP pooler with authentication or authorization wrapped around it with row-level security. So it's just a very nifty tool, and it is incredibly scalable as well. It's funnily enough written in Haskell, which allows them to do some pretty neat things with introspection and all sorts of weird quirks of what the tool does. Actually, I was using it the first time I came across it was in my previous company. I started using it to quickly do a few proof of concepts, and I just wanted to get started extracting data out of the PostgREST database without having to build the API myself. So I was using it, and then I realized, this is actually saving me a lot of time on just building APIs. Why don't I just use it for all the APIs? And from there, I started using it, and I wrote a blog post about how good it was and how we're using it in our company. And actually, that's the first time that I kind of interacted with Steve, who was a maintainer of PostgREST. And he somehow discovered the blog post. I'm guessing it came up on Google or something like that. he put it into the documentation as like a highlight of here's how people are using it in the wild. And I just wrote to Steve. I saw the PR come up, and I found Steve's name. He had contributed it, and I just emailed him just to say thanks. And that's all. For a couple of years, nothing more than that. Then we got into YC, and we started building the company, and PostgREST became one of the sort of integral parts of what we're building. And so I emailed Steve and I said to him, hey, we're going to adopt it. Are you okay with that? And by the way, how are you? What are you up to these days? And he said, yeah, that's fine. And these days I'm actually doing nothing. I just stopped one of my jobs and now I'm looking for a new job. So we essentially went ahead and we had to ask our YC partners, right? So, I mean, what is the advice that they give us?
So the number one piece of advice that you get when you start YC is do not hire anyone during the batch, because you've just been given a bunch of cash. The first thing people want to go out is just like hire developers, like hire a bunch of people, and so the generic advice is like just do not hire anyone. But when we went to our group partner and we said, oh, the maintainer of PostgREST, it's this tool we rely heavily upon, is open to work, their advice was hire him immediately, which was a bit of a shock because we'd just been bombarded with this do not hire advice. And it turned out to be a great move, actually.
It was great, yeah. So that was kind of our first, the sort of mandate that we gave them was just keep on contributing to PostgREST. And that's it. So it was kind of our first real way of giving back to open source. We had benefited a lot from PostgREST, all the tooling that we're doing. And of course, we're developing ourselves. But this was one way which just felt the most tangible. We're going to employ someone only to work on this tool. And that was pretty cool.
I think there's another huge benefit of open source and hiring, which is the people who typically are maintainers or large contributors to projects are already very well versed in asynchronous workflows, which is so important for us as a remote company, right? Is that like these people do a lot of communication over GitHub, a lot of their written communication is just excellent, and it's just a crucial skill in this modern remote era. And we have people everywhere now, right? Like New Zealand, Peru, Newfoundland.
We're in 22 different countries or something like that now. Yeah.
Crazy. Okay, so the next open source tool which we've been supporting is Elixir. So maybe, again, just give a very quick high-level overview of what Elixir is.
Yeah, well, Elixir is a programming language and actually is built on top of Erlang. So it kind of is a layer on top. You could think of it that way. And it's built especially on top of this thing called Beam, which is like a runtime for Erlang virtual machine. Now, we've been using Elixir for a long time. And the thing that it does very well is kind of concurrent connections, especially like WebSockets or maintaining connections with WebSockets and spinning up, many servers which can communicate together. And it was one of the first tools that we released was the real-time engine on top of Postgres, where you can listen to changes coming out of the Postgres database, and you can subscribe to them using WebSockets. So that was built with Elixir, and that was the thing that we used in my previous company, which kind of spun out and we created Supabase around it. So we've been long-time Elixir users. Now we use it for a lot of things, our logging engine, our real-time engine, a few other smaller things internally as well. And we're really happy to support Elixir. And most notably, in the last ElixirConf in Europe, they announced that they're investigating adding type support to the language, which is going to be actually quite a long project, and it's going to take a couple of years to investigate and see whether they'll do it right. And so we're supporting and sponsoring. We're one of two sponsors who is helping to fund that research and that work.
And so what about Chris?
Chris McCord. Okay, so Chris McCord is the creator of a framework called the Phoenix Framework. And this is one of the most popular, or probably the most popular frameworks for building with Elixir. So you can build whole applications, APIs. It's kind of like a Rails type framework, very easy to get started. And we've also added him as a technical advisor to the company, and we'll be, essentially giving back. We'll give him some of our equity in the company as a big thanks to for the framework that he's built, and also because we're using it within the company so heavily, we feel it's only fair that he sort of benefits from some of our success. So one of the other things that we've been investigating, or we're trying to research the best way to really pay open source maintainers, and we've done a lot with Open Collective. Maybe you can share a bit what we do with Open Collective.
Yeah, for sure. So Open Collective is a platform which to date, I think we've paid over $70,000 to open source contributors. And basically you come in, you do some work in the community, and you send us an invoice for the work that you've done as an open source contributor to a Supabase related project. And of course, not everyone likes to be paid for their open source contributions. You might just do it as a hobby. It might take the fun out of it, actually, if you're receiving a paycheck for it. But a lot of people do need it to sustain their work. And some of the stuff that we use Open Collective for are things like the Supabase client libraries. The company itself, we focus a lot on the JavaScript and Flutter libraries, but we also have client libraries for Python, C#, Go, I think Rust is in the works, and these are all community driven. And we just are always looking for ways where we can give back to these people who are working so hard in building these client libraries, which are all really just high quality pieces of engineering and just useful for so many people who are adopting Supabase.
Yeah. So how would someone become part of the Supabase collective?
Typically the way it works is they've already built some client library or useful tool, and they've been maintaining it for a while. And in those cases, we'll reach out to you and we'll offer to invite you to our Open Collective. There's also other ways to get involved in the community. We have a SupaSquad, which is a squad of volunteers, and it can be anything from making open source contributions to moderating our Discord. And again, this is the great thing about having an open community is we didn't even found the Supabase Discord. It was a community member who is still a moderator today. I think the Supabase subreddit was started by a Reddit user who then invited us to be moderators on the Supabase subreddit. So there's all these amazing people who are now members of our SupaSquad, and we meet up once a month, and we usually invite a special guest to talk about their work or community. And we also give sneak peeks and special news about what's coming up next in Supabase to this group as well. And there's also obviously exclusive SupaSquad swag as well. So if you just Google SupaSquad, you'll find out how to apply and maybe how to get more involved in the Supabase community. Another big decision we had when we were building our cloud functions was obviously who to partner with, and open source played a big part in that decision, right, as well. I don't know if you want to talk about Deno and the work we do with those guys.
Yeah, some functions. So when we started investigating different approaches, it became clear that sort of the V8 isolates on the edge was the way that would be supported going forward, and just made the most sense with our sort of product offering. And there were two clear sort of providers that we investigated. That was Deno, who have a sort of extension on top of V8 for running V8 isolates, and also Cloudflare workers. they're very similar in terms of what they offer and in terms of functionality, but the way they do things is slightly different. And the main thing that they do differently is, or at least at the time, the main thing that was different in our mind, which was a deal breaker, was that Deno was open source and Cloudflare Workers was not open source. But since we actually released Deno, we were really quite vocal with the Cloudflare team that this was quite a priority for us. And since then, actually, they've open sourced the Workers runtime.
And it's worth calling out as well that the way we build things in general in Supabase is we always try and adopt existing open source tools and communities first before building our own, because there's always a temptation to just say we're going to write it from scratch, we're going to build it from the ground up. But just as part of the open source philosophy, we just find it's just so much more better for everyone if you don't reinvent the wheel, right? And you just fuel the development of some other popular open source tool that already has a strong community, and we just, like you said, pay it back in any way we can. So we've talked a lot about what we've been doing so far as part of Supabase. Maybe we can talk about what we're going to use this Series B fundraise proceeds for and some of the work we're going to do in the future.
Yeah, so there are two really key things that we are aiming to deliver over the next year or two, both to do with the database and its features, which are just valuable to everyone. So the first one is moving the database closer to the user, so edge databases. We just want to always make sure that the database is moving as close to the user as possible, or the data is moving as close to the user as possible. This, of course, reduces latency, and it's just very beneficial to the end customer. The next one is database branching, and this one's becoming very popular as part of a development workflow. It's obviously very popular at the moment on the front-end side, making sure that you run a version of your website, for example, with every Git branch. You can see a preview, and then at the same time, you want a set of data for that preview. So we're investigating a few ways to do this, and we're planning to make it in a way that is native to PostgREST, so trying to support the community efforts to do this. So there are many ways that we could do branching within PostgREST, but the way that we, of course, always try to tackle things is to support community-driven efforts and find ways that we can make sure that it's all upstreamed into the database so that all PostgREST users will benefit from the work that we do. So we talk about these two things in our blog post and in a bit more detail, and you can go there and read about them.
Yeah, the link is in the description below.
Launch week is coming up. Maybe you can describe what launch week is, and I don't know, are there any things that you're allowed to talk about, sneak peeks, little tidbits that people might come to expect for the next week?
Yeah, so launch week is an event we have every 3 to 4 months, where we just, we ship as much as possible and we just shout about it over the course of 5 days. And in the past, we've used launch week to announce features like edge functions, like Supabase storage, where you can store files, images and videos, that kind of thing. And launch week 5 actually starts on Monday, the 15th of August. And we'll be announcing a bunch of new and crazy things. The great thing about open source is if you go to our repos now, you can probably get your own sneak peek for what's going to be shipped in launch week, because there's very little secrets when everything you do is public and open source. So if you want some sneak peeks, that's my hot tip, is to just go to the Supabase GitHub and browse through some of the branches. Big shout out to everyone who's helped us on this journey so far, all the open source contributions. It doesn't matter whether you fixed a typo or you shipped the entire Python client library, everything is just massively appreciated. We have some guides on how to get involved if you still haven't made your first open source contribution. And we also have the SupaSquad, which you can apply to be a member of if you are an active member of the Supabase community.
And also thanks to all the community for being so incredibly kind and nice. One of the things that's quite shocking to me is always how nice everyone is. So if you're one of those nice people, please keep doing it. And if you're looking for a nice community, come join us, and please also be nice.
We definitely like nice people here at Supabase. To be a part of the action next week, make sure you head on over to supabase.com/launchweek and register your free ticket. There might even be some golden tickets left that unlock some super exclusive swag. And make sure you follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any of the exciting announcements. We'll see you next week.